Okay, hi everybody, I'm Naomi. Let me just tell you a little bit first about Northampton Neighbors. We are an organization that's having this speaker series that launched officially about a year ago to help folks 55 years and older stay at home, live in their homes independently, to lead full and independent lives. We are part of an international village movement. They call us villages. Um, and our group, Northampton Neighbors, even though we launched very recently, now has over 900 volunteer members. And we provide a range of services, although COVID has sort of knocked us over as it's knocked so many over. We now provide Zoom services like the speaker series, and we have a messenger service. We do there's a couple of things we do that are in person, like yard work, but most of our in-person services will have to wait until COVID ends, or we're allowed to be in touch with each other again. Let me talk a little bit about the logistics. Everybody's going to be muted throughout Mary Young's session. And by Nina Kleinberg, who, let me say, is our fabulous volunteer technical advisor who the organization wouldn't survive without. And the way we're going to try and run it is, I think probably most of you know that at the bottom of your screen, there is a chat button. So after Mary Young finishes talking, which will be for about half an hour, you can click on your chat button, write a question, and hit enter, and we will get it and figure out the process by which we will respond. So it's probably best, unless you think you can't remember it, to save your question until she has finished speaking. Now to the reason you are here, which is Mary Young. We are honored to have her, and thank you so much for coming to give a talk in our speaker series. Mary is an internationally known researcher, writer, journalist who is coming back to the Valley for at least a visit today. She may come back more seriously sometime soon. We hope so. She received her BA at Case Western Reserve, a master's at University of Massachusetts right here, and her PhD at Boston University. She had director of communications at UMass before she went to Boston University to write her dissertation about the very topic she's talking about today, a topic which she is a key expert on and has spent many years researching and writing about. That is single adults who don't have a partner, spouse, or children with them. After getting her PhD, she became a senior researcher and then principal researcher at the conference board, which probably many of you know is an extremely well-known nonprofit organization that does important research, where she continued her work on older adults there and became more and more well-known and gave talks all over the world. I could continue with her list of accomplishments, but she told me if I did that, I'd sound like an academic. So, but I did Google her, as many of us do. And if you want to hear more about her, boy, there are thousands of links to her work. So finally, let me introduce and thank Mary Young, who's going to talk to us about her talk today with her talk titled Aging on Your Own. She'll talk for about 30 minutes and then we'll have questions and answers. Welcome, Mary.
Great, thank you. I'm really glad to be here. And as Naomi mentioned, I lived in the Valley 14 of the happiest years of my life. I retired in November and my plan was to move back this spring. And of course, COVID pulled the rug out from under that. So as soon as things get better, I'm moving back and really excited about doing that. But this topic is one that I've been interested in personally for at least 30 years. And I wanted to tell you about the experience that kind of put me into this frame of mind. I was living in Boston 30 years ago, and I was driving to a meeting in the morning. I had to take the horrible Route 128 around Boston, and the traffic was bumper to bumper, barely crawling. And, you know, I was frustrated, but then I looked ahead and I saw that the car in front of me had just rapidly slammed on its brakes. So I slammed on my brakes too. And as I did, I looked in the rearview mirror And I watched as the car behind me smacked me, and then the car behind that person smacked, bang, bang, bang. In about a minute, there were almost 20 cars piled up. And those of us whose cars were totaled or seriously wrecked were taken by the friendly state police to a tow yard. And there, the woman who ran the place said, you know, please use the telephone if you'd like to call a family member to come and pick you up. And for the first time in my life, I experienced this horrible question about who do you call in an emergency? I'm divorced, I don't have any children, and my family lives in another state. So I was panicked. And so I went to the back of the line and let other people go forward because I really didn't know who could I call, what would not seem presumptuous of me, and who in my life in the middle of a workday would drop everything without question and come and pick me up. So that was I was much younger then, of course, and I hadn't thought about what it would be like to age as a person who wasn't married and who didn't have adult children to take care of her in her old age. But that was probably my wake-up call. And it's a topic that I've become increasingly interested in. And now that I've retired, it's something that I am actively doing research on. So I'm going to share some highlights from that research, because what I want to do is give you a sense of what's the size of this population? How common is it for people to be in this position? What are some of the challenges they're going to have as they age? And what might you, if you're a solo, but even if you're not a solo, start doing now so that you're taking good care of yourself for your future? So I thought it would be really interesting. We have a good number of people who've come to the Zoom meeting today. And I wanted to ask you if you would just, let's see, there we go. This is a really simple way of categorizing people's parent and partner status. It is not filled with rich innuendo, but this is simple. Either you have the spouse or partner, yes or no, and you have one or more children, yes or no. So giving that little 2x2 categorization, we're going to now have a polling question and ask you to answer one of these options. You have a spouse and partner and one or more children. You have a spouse or partner but no children. You have one or more children but no spouse or partner right now. We're talking today. Or you have neither a spouse or partner nor children. So Nina, may we have the poll, please?
Yes. 20% have a spouse or partner and one or more children. 12% have a spouse or partner and no children. 28% have one or more children but no spouse or partner. And 40% have neither a spouse or a partner nor any children.
Okay, so that's really interesting. I'm going to show you how this compares to the general population. And I know that our poll today reflects the fact that we probably have attracted a larger number of people who are in that category, which we would call solo. And that is not having a spouse or partner currently and not having children. So here's a formal definition that may be helpful to you. I will use the term solo to define people who have three characteristics. One is that we're going to talk about people who are 65 and older. We're going to talk about people who are not married for any of the reasons shown here on the screen. And there's a real variety of reasons why you aren't married. I mean, you might not be married, and then or other statuses other than being married. And then finally, when we talk about having children, we get into some kind of gray areas because some people simply don't have children. Some people have children, and surprisingly often, those children are estranged. By one analysis, about 17% of adult children are estranged from their parents. Your child could be disabled or deceased or live very far away. So these are all things that would affect, in fact, whether or not those children were going to be of help to you as you age. So, this is our working definition. And if you struggled a little bit to put yourself in one of those four categories, I think that highlights the fact that these are not, I mean, this is not super scientific, and there are a lot of innuendos and gray areas, and we'll talk about some of those to go forward. But the main thing I want to just say here, I'm not going to talk about these bullets, but it isn't as if all solos are the same. There are many, many ways in which they could be different, and their circumstances could be radically different. Just having a lot of money and not having very much money. Certain ethnicities, you get a much stronger tradition of everybody in the family gets taken care of by younger people, not just parents. Where you live, if you are in an urban area, you're going to be close to services, you're going to have a lot of other solos around you, and you're not so isolated. Whereas if you live in a rural area, and certainly hill towns in the valley would be good examples of this, you're going to be much more isolated. There might not be as many services for you, and you might not know as many other solos. There might not be as many right near you. So now let me just give you some sense that there is actually a growing interest in solos. And for example, here are some recent articles from some leading media outlets talking about issues like emergency contacts, or planning for your elder care, or leaving a legacy, etc. But there's been a lot of coverage of this issue, I think more and more all the time, as journalists come to realize, ooh, this isn't some bizarre, obscure, tiny little subgroup. This actually is a significant group, and I'm going to show you that it's growing. There has been an emergence of a bunch of guidebooks, and these are all pretty good. So you can probably get the slides afterwards, and these might be of interest to you. And this is one of my favorites. This was promised for the fall, but I think probably COVID is going to delay this. But this is a new television series starring Cyndi Lauper and Jane Lynch as a new incarnation of the Golden Girls. These are women who have never had children, and they've never married, and they're in their 60s and they're living together. So it's going to be a Netflix series too. So if you've ever felt marginalized because you are solo or think you're the exception, I hope one of the things I'm going to do is change that perception that this is a growing and increasingly significant population. So I want to give you a few demographics to back that up. And not everybody likes numbers and charts. I promise you there will not be too many, but I want to just leave you with a few really key points. The first is that if we just think of marriage, if you look at people who are 65, 45% of that population, people 65 and older, is unmarried. So it's almost half. And if you compare men to women, men tend to be more, larger percentage of men are married. Over half of the women age 65 plus are unmarried. Now, again, they could be widowed, divorced, separated, so this is a very significant population. And of course, the percentage of unmarried people, men and women, increases as people age. Why is that? Well, I won't go into all the reasons, but here's a really interesting analysis that comes from Boston College, and it looks at trends in how much of their adult lives do women spend married. And if you look at this first cohort of people based on their birth date, and this goes back to the, I believe the 20s, I can't see because my number, let's see, it goes back to 1930. Women spent in that period, 72% of their adult lives married. Among the mid-boomers who were born 54 to 59, women were spending 51%, will spend 51% of their lives married, adult lives married. And that is already decreasing because there's been more years since that, and it's because boomers aren't having children as much. There's going to be a growing, as more and more of those boomers enter that group, there's going to be a higher percentage. So that the researchers who did this research concluded that women as a group were going to spend less than half their adult lives as part of a couple. Okay, so that's significant. Now, just briefly on parenthood, you probably know that boomers were much less likely than their predecessors to have children. And you can see on the left, sorry the numbers are a little bit indistinct, but in the Of the earliest cohort, this is 1926 to 35, only 9% of women in the US were childless. And when you look on up to 1965, that amount had climbed to 19% of women. And we know, and that was in 65. So those are people who were born in 65. This is not the most recent data, and therefore we just know that this is increasingly common. And you may say, well, what about men? Well, it happens that demographers only collect this data for women since they're doing the childbearing. So it's very hard to get data on men and parenthood. But clearly a trend here too. So what does this mean? That when you pull this together, this analysis here is based on 2010 data. So it's dated in that we're having more boomers since 2010 move into this 65 plus age category. So if we measured this today, we'd see a larger number. But even in 2010, 23% of adults age 65 and older would qualify what we're calling solos. Although, admittedly, we're including partners, and this is based on marital status. So this is, this is a slightly different definition, but that's a very significant portion of the adult population, and one that's growing. So just to summarize what I hope you've seen from those 4 charts is that older you are, the more likely that you're unmarried, especially if you're female. And about 1/4 of the over 65 population was single without kids. They were solo in 2016, and we know that's already growing bigger. So not an insignificant group, and this has huge implications. Now, if we were policymakers, or if we were people providing professional services like financial planning or retirement planning or estate planning or elder care, etc., we would be talking about the implications for our particular work or our concerns or agenda. Today, I want to talk just about the implications for solos as individuals. And you'll see some of these also could spill over to others of you who may not be solo today, but may find yourself more like a solo as you continue to age. So I'm going to talk about each of these areas of implication. So I want to tell you a few stories. This is my lovely cat, Mario, and he's here because when I used to travel a lot with my work, I would have my neighbor from up the hill come and take care of him. And I don't know tons about her, but she's slightly older than me. And my impression is she is, she's living on a very fixed income. So I always felt good about the fact that I was having her come and take care of my cat pretty often. And based on the fact that we had some important things in common, like we both like cats, and we're both kind of in the same age and we're solos, I would, part of conversation, always bring up these interesting things I was learning or interesting things I just read about solos. And she was never very interested. In fact, one time I brought this up to her and she said with, I thought, an audible, perceptible sense of annoyance, Mary, you really like thinking about this, and I really don't. And I realized then what a foolish assumption I was making for her. And I propose this probably because she's living in very limited financial means. This is scary. She does not, she's not thinking about being solo and the financial implications because they're terrifying to her. And I think this is true for lots of solos. So I'm going to try to talk about things that are both, some solutions that cost money and some that don't, because there's a diversity of financial means within this population. But we know that for sure, people who are living on a single income or a single Social Security check or even a single pension are going to have less money than couples who are living on two. And so this is, these are important issues for single people, not everybody, but for many. And moreover, we know from research that singles are less likely than married people to have gone to a financial planner. And they tend to be more anxious about their financial security than are married people. And not surprisingly, couples may go to a financial planner when they start having children and think about college, or they think about their grandchildren, and they think about their estate. There often are not, so solos don't have that driver. And I think there are multiple reasons why they might be slow to do that. Partly because, there are so many, there's a lot of ambiguities they'll talk about when you're solo and you're planning for your future. So another area where solos have particular challenges is in the area of estate planning and leaving a legacy. And I think of my friend Bill, who was a career postman in Brattleboro, and he did the same route for decades. And one day he got a call from a lawyer in town. He said, "Hey, Bill, did you hear about Joe Smith?" And Bill said, "Yeah, I think he died." And the lawyer said, "That's right, he did. And you know what else? He made you his executor." Well, this was total news to my friend Bill. He just was aghast to think of this. But apparently this guy, Joe Smith, lived by himself and always have lived in a little rented room, didn't have anybody else. And Bill, the mailman, was probably the person he saw most often and who always came to his house, perfectly reliable. And so when it came to naming an executor, unbeknownst to Bill, Bill was named. Not a good way to do estate planning, and really not a good idea to spring this on somebody, but I think it speaks to the fact that for many solos, who you name as executor is not entirely clear. Because again, it's a big ask. Who are you going to ask? To whom do you feel entitled to ask, or who'd be willing to do this? Another issue has to do with how you're going to be remembered. I love this quote. I heard it first attributed to a rabbi, but we die twice. Once when the last breath leaves our body, and once when the last person we know says our name. And I think this is a dilemma for solos. If you have children, you can be sure that your children and your grandchildren will remember you. How they remember you is another matter, but you will be remembered. And if you don't have children or grandchildren, I think you have more, rightfully, you need to ask yourself, who is going to remember me and how will I be remembered? And think about that in terms of what you'd like to do or what you could do now to shape that. So that's legacy and estate planning. Just two more here in terms of issues. One is healthcare. I don't know about you, but I've visited people who were in the hospital seriously not doing well, and their spouse was there, and the spouse was staying overnight, and the spouse was, talking to the doctors and collecting information and Googling up things to find out more about the condition and asking questions, et cetera. And I sat there and I thought, oh my gosh, who will do this for me? Because there's a tremendous amount for a spouse or an adult child to do. It can make a huge difference in your care and your recovery. And yet, for those of us who are solos, there's often not anybody who's clearly going to take on that responsibility. Here's some interesting data. I think this may be my last chart. You'll be glad to know that overall, family members provide 95% of the care for elders who are not living in nursing homes. So basically, the question is, how are solos going to make up for that? How are they going to replace that 95% of care that's provided informally by family members? Okay, so maybe they've got nieces and nephews who are devoted to them. Maybe they've got wonderful neighbors, or maybe they've got the means to hire an elder care advisor, who can coordinate all this. But that question is really a significant one that solos should be thinking about, and communities need to think about it in terms of providing for people. Here's a recent survey that was conducted online, a Facebook group of people who are solos, and they were asked, how many relatives do you see or hear from at least once a month? And as you can see from the left, over a quarter of the people said none. There were no relatives they heard or saw from or saw, and a quarter of them, over a quarter of them, said it was just one relative. Well, you know, this is a lot of care for one person that you hear from perhaps once a month. So these issues about, and these are not, this is, I'm going to get to solutions, so I'm not trying to do doom and gloom here, but these are issues and concerns that we all need to be thinking about in advance. And I think for solos, there may be some different answers, and perhaps the questions are even more important to be thinking about. So the same survey, some other interesting findings. Almost 3/4 don't have someone to take them to the doctor all or most of the time. These are solos. 70% had not identified a caregiver younger than themselves. Now that's really important, because if you're depending on your friends and your friends are about the same age you are, then that's a little bit tenuous. So 70% didn't have a younger caregiver they'd identified, and over half of them didn't have someone to help make them make medical decisions. So that speaks to an area of vulnerability that really solos need to think about. Even my neighbor uphill, even though it's scary. So finally, I want to just briefly talk about living arrangements. You know, the vast majority of people surveyed by AARP, these are people 55 and older, all say they want to age in place. And I know that that's one of the objectives for Northampton Neighbors and other neighborhood network groups, is to help people age in place. And there may be, you know, some people have raised the question, is this really a good thing for solos to be aiming for, or should they be exploring other options that might help them meet some of their other, I mean, if they're living in a house by themselves, perhaps they should be considering some other options that would help them meet some of the needs I've just talked about. But here's what we know is that living alone is increasingly common as people get older. And it's even more so for women. So it's something that lots and lots of people, and if they're lucky, they have a Northampton Neighbors they can call on. But it will be a challenge for people increasingly as they age. Okay, so that's I'm going to call it the bad news, but those are some of the issues and challenges that I think all people should be thinking about as they're aging, but that solos need to confront with some particular urgency. And, you know, I think when you're a solo, one of the things you've done is to get very good at taking care of yourself, at being self-reliant and independent. And it's very satisfying to know that you can take care of yourself. But as we grow older, that may not be possible to the extent it has been in the past, and it may even be dysfunctional. If you're totally self-sufficient, you are going to be increasingly isolated. So I think what I want to talk about next is about how solos can take good care of themselves, but not see this as something that they do solo, that it's about accessing other resources that can help you. Now, all of us, when we age, have needs for help. And here are some examples of things that everybody has and some things that some people develop as needs. So that's universal. And every one of us needs, in order to meet those needs, whether they're for medical care, I mean, you know, a decision and helping to make decisions, or just feeling connected and feeling supported, feeling loved, and feeling known as a person. We all need a personal safety net to get us there. And there's a wonderful website that I came across and I recommend to you. And you know, they define, it's all about personal safety nets and how to build them and what they ought to involve and who ought to be in it. And this is for anybody. And it's not even just for people over 65, but they define a personal safety net. And in the bottom, you can see these are the people who give your life meaning and support and ease, etc., and give you peace of mind that you're not alone, and knowledge that you don't have to, you know, go it by yourself. So we all need this, and lots of people need help building this, but there are reasons why this is particularly challenging for solos. This is really, I think this is a really important slide. First of all, who's in your safety net is maybe less obvious to you if you're a solo. If you have 4 children and have a spouse, there isn't a big question mark about, who's my safety net here? Generally, that's very explicit. I think of that as being sort of hardwired. That's anybody you filled out a little questionnaire. Somebody would know who they probably should call because, they've got a spouse and they got these children. When you're a solo, it isn't as clear, and it may be ambiguous to you, and it certainly is ambiguous to other people. Another reason that this is important is that for solos, this tends to be much more fluid. Somebody I know was telling me about her repeated recurrence of cancer. And I was talking about, healthcare proxy and sort of safety net. And she said what she discovered was the people who were part of her safety net the first time she had cancer, 2 years later, those relationships had changed. Maybe somebody had moved, or maybe the friendship had cooled off. Maybe somebody else in her life, a neighbor, friend, had become more important. So I think unlike families where there's change, but there's also less change. They can be much more fluid. You could even say fragile for solos. You can't assume that if you figure this out once that you're going to be all set 5 years from now. It's also more complex because you may be spreading various tasks around more people who are different places, who have different strengths, etc. You may have to be more creative in thinking about who could back you up in this way, that way. And then finally, I think it's more risky because we've all heard stories. What often happens, my colleague Anna Rappaport is on the call, I know, and she has written about this topic and said that, in the retirement field, what you hear about is the person who, let's say, has a cleaning person, and they get the solo gets older and older, and as they get really old, who do they know who can help them? Well, the cleaning person. So maybe the cleaning person could become their executor, or could become their the person who goes to the bank and helps them look in the safety deposit box or whatever. So you're a wonderful cleaning person, but unless you've done a really good job of figuring out who all the players are and who you trust for various responsibilities, you may be stuck with choosing the people who are most accessible to you, and that isn't always the safest choice. And for all these reasons, I think solos have a particular need to be very conscious and intentional about identifying who's their safety net, and they need to keep checking it, and they may need to update it, sort of maintain it over time, and it's not a once and done exercise. So I want to close with just a couple of examples. This is a model that comes from Davis Financial Group, for whom we've underwritten this research, and this is a model in which maybe you come in because you're seeing a financial planner, and what happens over time is as you work with that planner, then it becomes apparent that, wait a minute, you really need to work on an estate plan. Well, maybe that financial planner could connect you to an attorney who could do that for you. Maybe you get to the point where you say, I want to come up with a care plan in case I become unable to care for myself. Well, maybe, the financial planner also can point you to some elder care advisors or agencies, but it's building a kind of a network around you so that when you need various kinds of assistance, you're not having to come up with all the names yourself. It's not your own research project. You can kind of depend on an established network. So this is one way of approaching. And another way, comes from the personal safety net, but in their version here, it's kind of a hybrid between personal and professional safety net. So you're using some professionals where you need them. It's also something that's nice in this model is they're talking a lot about the reciprocity. So you could help somebody with one thing, and really you don't want to end up in your advanced age being somebody who just needs things but hasn't helped other people along the way. And Northampton Neighbors, again, is the epitome of this, where it's about what do you have you can offer, who can you help, and ultimately down the line, maybe there's something you need and other people in the network could help you with that. But this model involves both, professional kinds of safety net help as well as personal. And this too, and their advice too, is about checking this out over time, and it's not like, some people would write a will or draw up a trust document and it's going to last them a long time. We hear from professionals, I've heard from professionals in my research that this is less true with solos. It's needs to be revisited more often. So let me just wrap up with a couple of concluding thoughts. One is that self-reliance is a great thing. And I think if you're a Yankee like I am, a New England Yankee, it's really bred in the bone that you take care of yourself and be proud of it. But I think it can become somewhat dysfunctional, not only because it may not be feasible as you age, but it's also very isolating being self-reliant. And that's not going to work for you. Second of all, if you are a person who doesn't like thinking about these things, that is really increasing the risk. You're basically putting yourself at risk, maybe at great risk. If you think about all those decisions that need to be made as you get much older, let's say about your medical care or about having a procedure or a financial decision, do you really want to outsource that to just any old person who happens to be on call for that? Or do you want to take some preemptive steps in advance? So my advice, and I'm concluding this, is that you need to think about yourself now. What are your resources? What are your areas of strength? Where are the uncertainties, the gaps? Where is their potential? In business, it's called a SWOT analysis: strengths, weaknesses, opportunities, and threats. And also, what are some future scenarios you ought to be thinking about? Thinking about what are the resources externally that you might be able to tap into, who could be your allies, etc. Remember that question about, do you have a younger person who could help you with some of your healthcare decisions later on if you needed it? I think that age thing is really important. Thinking about not just getting, but being giver as well. How can you sort of pay ahead and be a good network member? And you need to make these arrangements formal and visible to somebody who's going to, suddenly comes when you've fallen on the floor and needs to know who to contact. It needs to be accessible to them too. And finally, even though you say, hey, this isn't about me because I've got a spouse and I've got these dependable children who are old enough to be doing this, you may find yourself, if you think about it, in all marriages, half of those people are going to end up not being married. They're not having that part of the solo, not having the marriage partner or the partner, and then they may also have challenges around their children. So I want to just tell you my favorite example of successful solo aging is this book, Miss Rumphius. If you haven't read it, it's a children's book. Oh boy, do I recommend it. Miss Rumphius, you can read this as, it's a short story, but one of the things when she's a girl and she says, I want to move to the city when I grow up. I want to go on adventures around the world. She tells this to her grandfather. And he said, that's just fine. But he said, one thing you must do in your life is to leave the world a better place than you found it. And Miss Rumphius does those things. She goes to the city and she travels around the world, and she eventually, when she hurts herself, comes back to live where she used to live in a little cottage by the ocean. And she eventually figures out, and the children from the town come and she tells them stories, so she's connected, but she figures out at last what's the thing she can do in this world to make it better than she left it, than she found it and so she gets huge amounts of lupin seeds and she scatters them around the coast and up and down. And so to this day, they say, those lupins that cover Maine are all because of Miss Rumphius, but she's figured out her legacy. So I think she's someone you can learn a lot from. She's certainly one of my models. So the last thing I want to do is tell you how you can get more resources if you're interested in this. I've just started doing a regular blog for a new newsletter that Davis Financial Group in Hadley is just started publishing. And I've written about some of these issues in greater depth, but I'll be doing more regularly, and there will be other bloggers as well on this topic of being solo, aging solo. So you can subscribe to that with this link. And then I also wanted, if you get in touch with me, I'd be glad to send you a short list of online resources that may be useful to you if you're aging solo. I'd also love to hear from you. If you have an anecdote you want to share, email it to me. Or if you want to talk, I'd be glad to do that. I'm also actively involved in doing research on this topic, and I'm looking for people I can talk to. So I'd love the chance to interview you. If you'd be interested, let me know. And when COVID finally ends and I move back to Northampton, I'll be doing focus groups, and I'd love to know if you'd be interested in being in a focus group as well. So we're now ready for questions. There.
Okay. Hi, everybody again. Before we go, we're about to go to question and answer, but before we do that, I want to do something that none of us like doing much, but that is to encourage you to be part of this give and take safety net. That is, we would like you to give to Northampton Neighbors, both financially and in terms of volunteer work. And Northampton Neighbor has no fees, dues, or charges because we want to be an inclusive organization. So, but we do have expenses. So that means that we have to be creative and dogged in finding funds for the organization. So we're going to put on at the end of this talk, we'll put up something telling you where to go to pay by check, credit card, or PayPal to make a contribution to this terrific part of the safety net. And now we're going to turn to questions and answers. And a number of you sent in questions on chat, most of which Mary addressed in the course of her talk. But what a number of them wanted to know was how to get in touch with you, how to get a list of the books, how to get to the website, the Personal Safety Net. And I think you provided all of that again. And if you go to Mary's email, you can get it again. Is that right?
Yes, that's true. And also, is there a way, Nina, for people to get the slides? Because that has...
And Nina recorded this session, and it will be available at Northampton Neighbors. So when you go to make your contributions, you don't have to make a contribution to look at it. You can also look at all parts of Mary's talk.
So the contact information is there too.
What I can do, if you'll put your contact information in the chat, is anyone who wants a record of the chat dialogue, I will email it.
Okay.
So now why don't we turn to, are we ready for, if you have any questions, just put them on chat and we're ready to go.
I see we have quite a few questions already.
Yeah. Most of them are about the sites, but one of the questions was whether you have thought about these issues in the context of COVID and the pandemic, and whether how that affects making connections and considering the issues that you addressed.
Yeah, you know, I think about that every single day. And partly I think that this is sort of like a dress rehearsal in a way. I mean, I feel as if living in COVID is a little bit like being an isolated elder who maybe can't get out of the house. And so I think it's, in a way, it gives you a chance to explore what the resources are and what are the creative solutions that you can come up with for staying connected with people. And I've been amazed by the way various groups have sprung to the fore to come up with, now, I mean, these Zoom meetings are one example. I've seen discussion groups online and Zoom where people who don't know each other are registering to go and do this, to participate in a discussion. I know churches and synagogues are organizing groups within their own congregations with discussion topics to help people connect. and they're also doing services that way. I've seen, you know, the Boston Globe will have a film and then have a discussion group. I'm sure that there are other organizations. I know that I'm sure there are other organizations in the Valley that are doing this. But so maybe part of the answer is you've got to have enough technology ability that you can participate in these things. But it's amazing how many creative ideas people are coming up with to stay connected to one another. And I think you have to be resourceful about finding out, you know, figuring out what those things are. You know, maybe you organize Zoom meetings with friends, or maybe you propose you post something. I'm just using Northampton Neighbors as an example, or any other people interested in getting together to talk about this. Or I've seen Zoom groups that are knitters, or that are, I mean, just about any interest you can imagine. And I don't mean the answer to everything is in a Zoom meeting, but I'm talking about the sort of infinite creativity that people have, you know, to overcome some of the adversities in this situation. And I think we can learn from COVID what sorts of events and resources and opportunities can be useful to people who would otherwise be very, very isolated, as we all are now.
So another question is, any examples that come to mind of interesting, original, creative ways that solo ager can build or strengthen their personal safety net?
A personal safety net, yeah. So let me just reel off some that come to mind right away. So we see people, I mean, you hear about people who are choosing where they retire to. And, you know, are they going to move into this community or move into that neighborhood? Maybe because they have other solo friends, and they're going to sort of, they agree that they're going to, you know, live near each other and help each other out. I think other creative ways, building a social safety net. I think you have to, you have to be in, you know, and I think it helps to be an extrovert, or it helps to be a person who has a certain amount of motivation, because I think you have to create these things for yourself. And staying connected. I have a wonderful friend who's in her mid-90s who teaches reading in the schools. She adores this being involved with kids, and she in turn is you know, connected with all these people who also really, really appreciate her. I had another 90-year-old friend who lived alone in an apartment, and when her neighbor moved, she's a fantastic person, and I went to go visit her, and I thought, oh, she'll be really lonely because her neighbor, who she saw all the time, has moved. And as I went to, you know, buzz myself in, a young couple came up, and they helped me by letting me in the door, and they saw me go downstairs to my friend's apartment. And they said, oh, you know Gudrun too? These were like 20-year-olds who just moved in the apartment, but she was that kind of person who, when she'd go to a nurse, she'd, you know, she'd fall, she'd break something. I'd go visit her in rehab. I'd say, how are you doing? She'd say, oh, we're having the loveliest time. And she'd tell me stories about all the people around her. So I think part of it is staying engaged with life. I heard at the American Society on Aging some years ago, there was a woman who was a Gray Panther from Berkeley, California. And she had become something of a media darling because speaking out about about issues of aging. And she was in her late 80s. And one of the things I'll never forget, she said, is every time I lose a friend dies, I make a new friend. I make a younger friend. And I think it's about figuring out ways you can be involved with life and life and people of whatever age. And I think that can really help you. If you just sort of sit and watch your friendship pool dwindle over time, you are really going to be left high and dry. So I think people can find creative living situations. It could be co-housing, it could be choosing a place because you know people there, or making a pact with people you know, or moving into a over 65 community, or reaching out, getting to know, you know, your Northampton neighbors, for example. That would be a great way to begin building a personal safety net. Figuring out, with people, what are the things that I have that I could help you with? What are the things you could help me with, etc. But I do think it has to be intentional and proactive, and you can't just hope for the best.
That's terrific. And I should say that a lot of the chat questions are really a number of what sound to me to be terrific resources, ranging from a course at Salem State to some materials at Forbes Library to various programs that Northampton Neighbors has, including a caller program. So if people feel isolated, Northampton Neighbors regularly call. We have a list, as well as a messages program where people are pen pals and exchange messages. So I think, Nina, you said you were going to put together the chat resources. Is that right? That's great. Yes. So it looks to me like there are a lot of really good ones that people have come up with. Are there any more questions for Mary? We're about to run out of time, but we might be able to take one more question, unless you want to make a final comment, Mary. Thank you. This was a really terrific presentation. Yeah. I didn't mean to interrupt.
No, I'm just going to say that I guess my parting words would be, I think it's easy to think of this as sort of like poor, pathetic solo people aging on their own. First of all, there are some really vibrant, alive, knock your socks off Miss Rumpiuses out there. And there are people all along the continuum. So it's great to have resources for lonely people or isolated people, and those are incredibly important. But I also don't want to paint this with just this being this unfortunate population, because I think we have to overcome the sense that this is a stigmatized group, a kind of nobody wants to be part of this kind of group, and also solos have a chance to do something about this, but they do have to be proactive. They have to figure out what they need to do and then do it, and they can help each other do it. But it's so those are my closing thoughts.
Those are terrific thoughts. And the very last question that came in was, is Northampton Neighbors open to members from other towns in Western Mass or only Northampton? Unfortunately, we're only open to people in Northampton, but these villages are opening up all over the place. So there may well be one in your community. And they are really, they really address exactly the issues that Mary has been talking about today. So I think we're ready to close. Terrific talk. Thank you so much.
Thank you, everybody.
I can mute everyone, but I can't unmute everyone.
Great talk.
Thank you.
Wonderful.
Thank you.
Thank you.
Thank you.